Why Argentine commanders couldn't explain how Britain sank their best warship in seconds dusk. May 2nd, 1982. The South Atlantic, about 36 miles outside the edge of a line the British themselves had drawn on a map. The sea is running heavy under a grey sky, the kind of light that turns from dusk to full dark in 20 minutes flat. Aboard the cruiser ARA General Belgrano, watch has just changed. She is zigzagging on a course that, if you drew it out, points away from the war, back toward the Argentine mainland, escorted by two destroyers, the Hipólito Bouchard and the Piedra Buena. Her captain, Héctor Bonzo, has every reason to believe his ship is safe. The exclusion zone the British had announced covers 200 nautical miles around the Falklands. His ship sits well outside it. That is the rule. That is what he was told the rule meant. At 1957 hours, the sea beside her erupts twice within seconds. Two torpedoes, each carrying 805 pounds of high explosive, strike the port side. One hits forward, outside the ship's armoured citadel, and tears open a hole big enough to walk a truck through. The second hits aft, near the stern, and takes out her steering and much of her power in the same instant. The lights go out across most of the ship. Bonzo, on the bridge, does not yet know it, but the vessel that just killed his cruiser has been sitting beneath the waves nearby for 2 days, and he never once detected her. Hold that for a second, because this is not really a story about a torpedo. It's a story about a line drawn on a map, who got to decide what that line actually meant, and how a ship that survived Pearl Harbor without a scratch was destroyed by a weapon design that predated her own commissioning. Let's get into it. To understand why Héctor Bonzo believed his ship was safe that evening, you need to understand the ship herself, because she was, by 1982, something close to a maritime relic with a genuinely strange biography behind her. She began her life as the USS Phoenix, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser laid down in 1935 and commissioned in 1938 for the United States Navy. On the morning of December 7, 1941, she was moored at Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese attack began, Phoenix got her engines turning and got out of the harbor under her own power, one of the few capital ships present that morning to escape the attack without serious damage. She went on to serve through the rest of the Second World War in the Pacific, survived it entirely, and in 1951 was sold to Argentina. The Argentine Navy renamed her 17 de Octubre, and later, after a change of government made that name politically awkward, she became the General Belgrano, named for the independence hero Manuel Belgrano. By 1982, she was more than 40 years old. Her hull was riveted, not welded, an older style of construction that made her, in one very specific sense, more vulnerable than a modern warship to the kind of below-the-waterline blow a torpedo delivers. She still carried 15 6-inch guns in her original turrets. She was, in effect, a Second World War cruiser, fighting in a war being decided by nuclear submarines and anti-ship missiles, and the men aboard her knew it. What they believed protected them was not her armor, it was geography, and a rule the British themselves had published. On April 23rd, before the Total Exclusion Zone was even declared, the British government had sent a message through the Swiss embassy in Buenos Aires, warning that any Argentine ship or aircraft that, in the British phrase, could amount to a threat to interfere with the task force's mission, would be liable to be dealt with accordingly, wherever it was operating. That warning existed, it sat in Argentine government files, and yet the operational culture inside the Argentine Navy, and inside Bonzo's own task group, treated the 200-mile exclusion zone as the actual boundary of danger, not that April warning. If you were outside the 200 miles, you were, in the minds of most of the officers involved, on the safe side of the war. This is the part worth sitting with, because it wasn't stupidity. The exclusion zone had been announced publicly, in specific nautical mile terms, by a British government that wanted the rest of the world watching this conflict to see a clean, bounded conflict with clear edges. Argentina's naval command read that boundary the way any professional navy would read a boundary drawn by its enemy, as a promise as much as a threat. Stay outside it, and you stay out of this particular fight. The Belgrano Group's mission on May 2nd wasn't even to attack. Admiral Jorge Anaya's plan was a pincer, with the carrier group built around the 25 de Mayo approaching the task force from the north while Belgrano's group covered the south, both of them meant to converge only if conditions were favorable. On the evening she was hit, Belgrano's group had in fact been ordered to turn back toward the mainland. She was steaming away from the fight. Her position and her heading told anyone who could see them that she was withdrawing, not closing in. None of that mattered, because 36 miles outside the zone, in the freezing water beneath her, a British hunter-killer submarine had been shadowing her for 2 days, and the rules that actually governed what happened next had already quietly changed. Before we get into how that submarine found her and what she carried in her torpedo tubes, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the moments that decided the Falklands War, the sort of story that never quite makes it into the 2-minute news summary, do me a favor and hit subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like Belgrano's crew and the men on both sides of nights like this one from disappearing into a paragraph in a textbook. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to a small channel trying to grow. The submarine was HMS Conqueror, a Churchill-class nuclear-powered attack submarine under the command of Commander Christopher Wreford Brown. She had sailed from Faslane in Scotland weeks earlier and had been operating in the South Atlantic since mid-April, one of several British submarines assigned to shadow the Argentine fleet. Conqueror picked up Belgrano's group on May 1st and shadowed her for roughly a day and a half before the order to attack ever arrived. This detail matters more than it sounds, because it means the submarine's crew spent that time simply watching, tracking the cruiser's zigzag pattern, timing her turns, listening to her escort's sonar and radio traffic, building up a complete tactical picture of a ship that had absolutely no idea she was being followed. Belgrano's own sonar equipment was, by 1982 standards, dated, and her escorts were tasked more with screening against air and surface threats than hunting for a submarine that nobody expected to find them 36 miles outside a boundary that was supposed to keep the war away. When the order finally came, it didn't come easily. It had to travel from the submarine's own chain of command up through Northwood, the British naval headquarters outside London, and from there to the War Cabinet itself, because Belgrano's position outside the exclusion zone meant this wasn't a simple tactical call. It was a political one, and everyone involved knew it. We'll get to that decision in a moment, because it's the real center of this story. First, though, there's a detail about the attack itself that tells you something about how the Royal Navy actually thinks, and it's a detail most people get wrong when they retell this story. Conqueror was carrying 2 types of torpedo that day. She had the modern Tigerfish, a wire-guided, homing torpedo that was, on paper, the more sophisticated weapon, and she was also carrying a stock of much older Mark 8 torpedoes, a design that dated back to the 1920s, straight-running, unguided, detonating on contact or by magnetic influence, the same basic type of weapon that had sunk ships in the Second World War. Wreford Brown chose the Mark 8s. The reasoning, laid out afterward by British officers and naval historians, wasn't sentimental. It was that the Tigerfish, for all its sophistication, had a documented history of reliability problems in service at that point, and Wreford Brown was not willing to gamble the single most consequential shot of the war on a weapon whose guidance wires might fail or whose homing head might not perform. He wanted a torpedo that would go where he pointed it and explode when it got there. Nothing clever, nothing complicated, just physics and 40 years of proven design. He fired 3, 2 hit. The third missed, or, in some accounts, failed to detonate against one of the escorting destroyers. Read that again, because it's the whole story compressed into a single tactical decision. Argentina had lost a Second World War cruiser to a Second World War torpedo, fired from a nuclear submarine that represented the absolute cutting edge of undersea warfare, because the man commanding that submarine judged, correctly, that the oldest tool in his arsenal was also the most trustworthy one. The future killed the past, but it borrowed the past's own weapon to do it. Now we come to the part of this story that outlasted the war itself in courtrooms, parliamentary inquiries, and newspaper front pages for decades afterward, because the honest answer to why Belgrano was attacked outside the exclusion zone has almost nothing to do with submarines and everything to do with a room in Buckinghamshire. On the afternoon of May 2nd, the British War Cabinet met at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, for a routine Sunday session that was about to become anything but routine. Margaret Thatcher and her senior ministers were presented with intelligence, largely gathered through decrypted signals traffic, suggesting that the Argentine fleet was maneuvering in a pincer formation, with the Belgrano group to the south and the carrier group to the north, both potentially converging on the British task force. The concern in that room was not where Belgrano was at that exact hour. It was where she might be in 12 or 24 hours, and whether her course could put her and her escorts within striking range of the two British aircraft carriers that represented, in the most literal sense, Britain's entire ability to fight this war at sea. This is the detail that gets lost in the decades of argument that followed. Belgrano's group had, in fact, already been ordered to reverse course and head back toward Argentina by the time the torpedoes struck. But nobody in that room at Chequers knew that with certainty, and even if they had known it, naval commanders on both sides understood that a warship's course can reverse again within the hour. A retreating cruiser, 36 miles outside a line on a map, is not a retired cruiser. It is a cruiser that can turn. So the War Cabinet approved a change to the rules of engagement, extending the authority to attack Argentine vessels beyond the boundaries of the Total Exclusion Zone itself, provided they were judged to pose a threat to the task force. The order was transmitted to northward, and from northward to Conqueror, and the submarine that had spent a day and a half quietly shadowing a ship that believed herself untouchable was finally released to fire. Here is where the honest telling of this story has to slow down, because the comfortable version, the one that gets repeated in a lot of retellings, treats this purely as ruthless British cunning outsmarting a naive Argentine command, and that isn't quite fair to either side. The Argentine Navy's reading of the exclusion zone wasn't foolish. It was the reasonable reading of a public declaration made by their enemy. The British decision to attack outside that zone wasn't dishonest exactly, because the April 23rd warning had already told Buenos Aires, in writing, that any ship judged a threat could be attacked anywhere. What actually happened is that two governments were operating on two different definitions of the same battlefield, one bounded by a specific number of nautical miles because that number had been announced to the world's press, and one bounded by the much older and much colder logic of naval warfare, which has never in its history cared very much where a line was drawn on somebody else's map. There was a further complication that made the decision, and its aftermath, considerably harder to defend in the years that followed. At almost exactly the moment the War Cabinet was approving the attack, a Peruvian brokered peace initiative was quietly circulating between Buenos Aires and London, an attempt to find a diplomatic path out of the war before it escalated further. The precise timing and the degree to which British ministers were aware of the details of that peace proposal at the moment of their decision became one of the most fought-over questions in British politics for the following decade, argued in parliamentary committees, in a cabinet leak inquiry, and eventually in multiple books written by journalists and former officials who reached different conclusions about how much weight that peace process should have carried in the room at Chequers. It's not a question this video can settle, and any honest account has to admit that the full internal record remains a subject of genuine dispute rather than settled fact. What is not in dispute is what happened next, 36 miles south of that line on the map, to 323 men who had no idea any of this deliberation was even taking place. If you want to see the next chapter in this kind of story, the moments where a single decision made in a quiet room ends up deciding a battle at sea, subscribing really does help this channel keep finding the people who'd want to see it. It's free, it takes about 1 second, and it tells me you'd like the next one made. Aboard Belgrano, the first torpedo struck the port bow, outside the section of the hull protected by her old armor belt, tearing open compartments and killing dozens of men instantly, many of them young conscripts asleep or resting in the forward berths. The second struck near the stern, wrecking her steering gear and knocking out much of her electrical power. Within minutes, the ship had lost the ability to steer, lost most of her lighting, and had begun taking on water far faster than her aging pumping systems could handle. Captain Bonzo, on the bridge, gave the order to abandon ship within about 20 minutes of the strikes, a remarkably fast call for a commander to make, and one that later analysis credited with saving a large number of lives, because the ship was listing badly and settling by the stern with a speed that made further delay dangerous. Getting more than 1,000 men into life rafts on a heaving, darkened deck in worsening seas at dusk in the South Atlantic in early May is its own kind of controlled catastrophe, and the crew of Belgrano largely managed it with discipline. Bonzo himself was among the last men off the ship. What followed was worse, in some ways, than the sinking itself. The ship's distress signal either failed to transmit properly or was not received and acted upon with the urgency the situation demanded, and for hours afterward, hundreds of survivors sat in life rafts in one of the coldest, roughest stretches of ocean on Earth, waiting for a rescue that was slow to arrive. The two escorting destroyers, themselves uncertain of the submarine threat around them and operating in worsening weather, took time to organize the search. Argentine and, eventually, Chilean rescue efforts pulled most of the survivors from the water over the following 2 days, but 323 men died, the great majority in the sinking itself or in the exposure that followed it in the rafts. It remains, to this day, the single largest loss of life in the entire Falklands conflict, on either side, in one incident. Aboard Conqueror, there was no equivalent horror to witness. A submarine crew that fires a torpedo does not see the fire, does not hear the screams, does not watch men go into freezing water. They hear an explosion transmitted through the water, and, if their sonar operator is good at his job, they hear the specific, awful sound of a hull breaking up as it sinks. Refford Brown's crew heard exactly that, twice, and then took their boat deep and quiet, because for all they knew in that moment, an angry destroyer with a working sonar set was about to come looking for the ship that had just killed their flagship. The strategic consequence of that evening arrived almost immediately, and it was decisive in a way that neither side fully anticipated at the time. Within days of the sinking, the entire Argentine surface fleet, including the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo, withdrew to port and did not sortie again for the remainder of the war. The risk that any other Argentine warship might share Belgrano's fate, sunk by a submarine nobody could detect, operating with rules of engagement nobody could reliably predict, was judged too great by the Argentine Naval Command. From that point onward, the war at sea around the Falklands was fought almost entirely in the air, with Argentine pilots flying missions from land bases against the British task force, a fight that produced its own brutal toll on both sides, but one that no longer involved the surface fleet that Belgrano's group had been part of. Consider what that single decision, made in a room at Chequers and executed by 3 old torpedoes fired from a submarine most of the crew of Belgrano never detected, actually purchased for the British war effort. It didn't just remove one cruiser from the board, it removed an entire navy's willingness to put its ships to sea for the rest of the conflict. The Argentine Navy still possessed destroyers, still possessed a carrier, still possessed trained crews, and none of it mattered, because the one lesson every officer aboard every remaining ship had learned, in the space of about 4 minutes, on the evening of May 2nd, was that the boundaries they'd been told to trust were not the boundaries that would actually decide whether they lived or died. Back in Britain, the news of the sinking reached London within hours, and the reaction split almost immediately along a line that has never fully closed since. The Sun newspaper, then edited under Kelvin Mackenzie, ran its early edition on May 4th, under a single word stretched across the front page, in enormous type, "Gotcha." The story beneath it treated the sinking as an unambiguous triumph, a British submarine outsmarting the Argentine Navy in open water. At the moment the paper went to print, the editors did not yet know how many men had died. As reports came in through the day of the scale of the loss, thought to be in the hundreds and eventually confirmed at 323, the tone inside the Sun's own newsroom curdled fast. Later editions that same day replaced the headline with something considerably more subdued, reporting the loss of life directly rather than celebrating it. Mackenzie always maintained the original headline was a fair reflection of the mood of the moment, and plenty of readers agreed with him. Others, including some who worked alongside him, called it one of the most poorly judged front pages in the paper's history. Both things can be true. A newsroom on deadline printed the mood of a country that had just watched its navy strike a real blow in a war most people still weren't sure Britain could win, and only afterward did the human cost of that blow arrive in full. For the government, there was no such wavering, at least not in public. Margaret Thatcher's cabinet presented the sinking, from the first day, as a hard but necessary act of war against a fleet that posed a genuine and immediate threat to the task force and the men aboard it. The official position never really moved from that line for the rest of her time in office. Belgrano was a warship, escorted by armed destroyers, operating in a war zone that both governments understood to be a live and moving thing, not a fixed rectangle on a chart that ended all danger the instant a ship crossed its edge. British sailors were at risk. The decision to remove that risk, whatever the cost, was framed as the plain duty of a government at war. And at home, in the spring of 1982, with British troops already ashore and dying on the islands, that framing was largely accepted. Polling at the time showed solid public support for the sinking, and it stayed that way for years. The trouble was that the story did not stay simple for very long, because almost nothing about it actually was. Within weeks, backbench MPs, most persistently a Labour member named Tam Dalyell, began asking a question that the government struggled to answer with a single consistent version of events. Why had a ship that was, by her own logged position and heading, sailing away from the exclusion zone at the time she was attacked, been treated as a threat, serious enough to justify killing 323 men in the space of about 4 minutes? The government's early explanations for the timeline of the decision shifted more than once as the story developed, not because ministers were caught lying outright, but because the full sequence, the intelligence about the Argentine pincer movement, the timing of the rules of engagement change, the question of what exactly London knew about the Peruvian peace initiative circulating at the same hour was genuinely tangled, and every attempt to simplify it for a 5-minute answer in the Commons left something out that critics could seize on. That argument hardened into something close to a permanent fixture of British politics for the rest of the decade. In 1984, a civil servant at the Ministry of Defence named Clive Ponting leaked internal documents relating to the Belgrano decision to Tam Dalyell, believing the public had been misled about the timeline of events leading up to the attack. Ponting was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act in a trial that became a genuine sensation, and in February 1985, a jury acquitted him outright, apparently unpersuaded that leaking evidence of a government's internal deliberations to Parliament amounted to a crime against the national interest. The acquittal did not settle the underlying dispute about Belgrano. If anything, it widened it, because it confirmed there had been more going on behind the scenes than the government's early public explanations had suggested, without ever proving that anything improper had actually taken place. Books followed for years afterward, some written by journalists convinced the sinking was a deliberate act to scuttle the Peruvian peace plan and prolong a war Thatcher's government needed politically. Others written by naval historians and former officers who walked through the tactical logic of the pincer threat in painstaking detail and concluded the decision was defensible, even necessary, on its own military terms, regardless of what the diplomats in Lima and Buenos Aires were quietly discussing that same weekend. Parliamentary committees returned to the question more than once. None of it produced a single, universally accepted account of exactly how much weight the peace initiative carried in that room at Chequers, and it likely never will, because so much of what actually gets said inside a war cabinet meeting is never written down in a form that survives to satisfy a historian 30 years later. What can be said honestly is that the sinking remained, for the rest of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, and long after it ended, the one episode of the Falklands War that refused to settle into comfortable national memory the way the recapture of Stanley did. It is the chapter of that war people still argue about at dinner tables. Héctor Bonzo lived with the sinking for the rest of his life, in a far more direct way than any politician in London ever had to. He survived the abandonment of his ship, was among the last men off her deck, and spent the following decades doing something that could not have been easy for a career naval officer whose command had ended in the worst single loss of life either side suffered in the entire war. He talked about it, repeatedly, on the record, to journalists, to naval historians, to parliamentary bodies on both sides of the Atlantic, always returning to the same central point, that Belgrano was heading home when she was hit, that her course and her heading that evening were logged and known, and that the men under his command had done nothing in those final hours to invite what happened to them. He never disputed that his ship had been a legitimate target of war in the broader sense. He disputed the idea that she had been an active threat at the specific moment she was struck. He carried that argument, with what most who met him described as considerable personal dignity, right up until his death in 2009, at the age of 79. Christopher Refford Brown's homecoming looked entirely different, because a submarine crew returns from a war patrol into a silence that surface sailors never get. Conqueror sailed back into Faslane weeks after the attack, flying the Jolly Roger from her conning tower, the skull and crossbones that Royal Navy submariners have flown to mark a successful patrol since the First World War, when the tactic of sinking ships from underwater was still considered by some in the surface navy to be a slightly ungentlemanly way to fight. It was revived for Conqueror's return not as a boast but as a piece of genuine naval tradition, and it marked something that had never happened before in the history of naval warfare, and, as of today, has never happened since, a nuclear-powered submarine sinking a surface warship in combat. Refford Brown himself spoke about the action rarely and carefully in the years that followed, declining for a long time to discuss the operational details in public, aware that his own crew's actions sat at the center of an argument that was, by then, playing out almost entirely in London rather than in the South Atlantic, where it had actually happened. That is the strange, uncomfortable shape of this story, if you sit with it honestly, rather than reaching for whichever version flatters the side you already favor. Argentine commanders genuinely could not explain, in the hours and days that followed, how their best remaining warship had been found and killed so completely, so quickly, so far outside the boundary they had been told marked the edge of the danger. The honest explanation was never a secret weapon or a failure of Argentine seamanship. It was that two governments were reading the same war from two different maps, one drawn in nautical miles for the world's newspapers, and one drawn in the older, colder terms that navies have always actually used to decide who gets to come home. 323 men paid for the gap between those two maps, aboard a ship that had once sailed calmly out of Pearl Harbor while the battleships around her burned, only to end her long life 36 miles past a line that was supposed to mean safety, and didn't.